Hello, everybody. Welcome into another episode of the Fantasy Pros Football Podcast. I am Ryan Wormley, joined on this Tuesday morning by Alfredo Brown, our guest from Football Guys, and also by Andrew Erickson. You guys don't care about him. We're talking about some buy low, sell high wide receivers as we enter Week 10 officially into the second half of the season. Always hard to believe it comes so fast. Let's jump right into the most traded wide receivers. And the number one most traded wide receiver right now after Week 9 is a very big name. It's Davante Adams. Obviously, the Raiders coming off the big game. Adams not coming off of a big game. But Alfredo, as a guest, I'll start with you. Are you buying, selling, or holding on Davante Adams right now?
I want to try to sell if I can, and I know that sounds so counterintuitive to what we normally do. We say this is a good player, everything will regress to the mean, and he'll be good. The problem is here is just there's so many mitigating factors. We don't know what the offensive identity is going to be for this team going forward now that Antonio Pierce is the head coach. We really don't know how good or how bad Aiden O'Connell is going to be. I know there's a lot of like rah-rah around him, but we don't know how good he's actually going to be for fantasy. And there's not really anything from earlier on in the season that tells us that Davante Adams can get back to that type of production. He's been averaging over 9 targets a game, which is like fine. And, I'll keep throwing that out there with tears running down my face as I say, like, it was a good process, right? But he's been the wide receiver 45 or worse in 4 of his last 5 games. And the one game where he wasn't, he was wide receiver 32. He's almost unstartable at this point because of how bad the Raiders have been. Now, there's a whole new, offense and a new world on the horizon for the Raiders, so it might get better. I just don't know that at this time of the year, I'm willing to take that chance. I guess it depends on what the cost would be. So, if you're a contender and you want to buy him for basically next to nothing, cool. But if you have him and you need to start making some moves and you want to package him for a better player, like a top 10 wide receiver, and you can package him, I'd probably do that. Last time he was actually startable was like Week 4. The schedule just does not get easier. So yeah, I'm off of Davante Adams.
Erickson, are you buying, selling, or holding?
I'm buying Davante Adams because right now, current standings, Jacoby Myers has more fantasy points than Davante Adams. Are we really going to bet on that happening for the rest of the season? Jacoby Myers is going to outscore Davante Adams. I don't bet on that. Like, Adams is wide receiver 16, Myers is wide receiver 15. Like, there are guys that have more points than Adams that I think you could flip to get him. Nico Collins is wide receiver 14. Mike Evans is wide receiver 13. Like, Adams leads the NFL in red zone targets. Like, it's similar to Tony Pollard, where it's like he just hasn't really scored since earlier in the year. So for me, he's still commanding a high target share. He still has all the great peripherals that you're looking for. He's still running the most routes. It's just Jacoby Myers, the guy that could never score touchdowns in New England, is now just scoring all the touchdowns for Las Vegas. So I just don't think that's gonna keep up. Adams, we know he's a wide receiver 1 in fantasy. Like, is he really gonna finish like as a wide receiver 2? I mean, I guess you could make the argument, oh, well, he's getting older, but it's not really an efficiency thing. Like, if you just watch him play, he looks fine. Like, it's not like he's like washed up now. He can't catch the ball. He can't get open. Like, I don't think that's the case. I think it's just he's running bad when it comes to touchdown variance. So I'm going to buy.
So let's do some real life trades here. These are actual trades that have gone down in my playbook. And these are, real ones, all involving Davante Adams. First one here, Davante Adams for Tony Pollard. Alfredo, would you make that trade?
Yeah, I'd rather have Tony Pollard.
Erickson, what do you think about that one?
Yeah, I think they're in similar situations, but I would rather have their running back than the receiver.
Alfredo, how about Davante Adams and Isaiah Pacheco for Jonathan Taylor?
Give me Jonathan Taylor. I'm going to lean towards the player that I think has that elite upside and the league winning upside versus the 2 guys that I think are going to be sort of ho-hum starters each week.
Erickson, Davante and Pacheco for Taylor.
I'll take anytime you can get an elite running back. Like, just receivers are just easier to replace, so I would go after Jonathan Taylor.
Last one here, Alfredo. Davante Adams and Gus Edwards for Jamar Chase.
Jamar Chase. Yeah, like not even a hesitation. Go give me Jamar. Actually, we got to be careful because there's all like the injury stuff creeping up with Jamar Chase that we don't know. If that all turns out to be fine, yeah, give me Jamar Chase there.
Erickson.
Jamar Chase. I'm going to try my best to trade CeeDee Lamb for Jamar Chase this week. That's my goal. So Chase for me.
Ooh.
All right. If you guys need new tires for your car, Discount Tire is your go-to. They have exceptional service, and you get a 30% shorter average wait time when you buy and book online at discounttire.com. They have this really cool feature called Treadwell, which is an online tire buying guide that gives you transparency on tire performance, as well as personalized recommendations based on your location and driving habits. Discount Tire is also the largest independent tire retailer in the country, so it has the biggest selection of tires and wheels. And here's a pro tip from the experts at Discount Tire. You can prevent wear and boost gas mileage by keeping your tires properly inflated. Tire pressure supports the weight of your vehicle and is important to check for safety. So if it's been over a month since you last checked your tire pressure, stop by one of their local stores for a free tire safety and air pressure check. Discount Tire, let's get you taken care of. Next, wide receiver here, most traded guy, DeAndre Hopkins. New quarterback, obviously, making an impact for him. Are we buying, selling, or holding on DeAndre Hopkins, Erickson?
I like the schedule for the Titans moving forward. It's pretty good. It's good for Will Levis, the quarterback. And you're seeing more from Levis than you, as like, just the Titans passing game as a whole than we were seeing it all with Ryan Tannehill, Malik Willis. So they're just willing to throw the ball more is like good for the bottom line with Hopkins. So I think that, I mean, at worst, he's going to be like a wide receiver too. So I think that he's probably a hold for me. Like if you wanted to sell him, you should have sold him after the 3 touchdown game. Like that was the prime time to sell. But we did see, some more lumps with him against the Steelers where, yeah, he was getting a lot of targets, but again, like, not super efficient, which I think is just going to be the only thing that kind of holds him back. So I think that he's probably just a hole for me. Like he's not someone I'm looking to necessarily buy just because I just don't believe in this Titans offense, like overall, even with Levis under center. So it'd be something I'm just kind of get away from, but I think that he's fine to hold and he's probably just going to be a wide receiver 2 from here on out.
He's valued in the expert consensus rankings right now as a wide receiver 3 high end. He's wide receiver 26 in the ECR, Erickson. So do you think that's too low then?
Let me see where I have him actually. So I know that, yeah, so I have him in the wide receiver 3 range as well. So again, it gets kind of muddied in this area. It really depends on like, does the guy have a bye week left? What's his schedule upcoming? Floor ceiling. I just don't think the ceiling is like super, super high. And maybe I'm wrong saying that because he had that 3 touchdown game, but that was kind of everything kind of coming together. There was no tape on Will Levis. Hopkins was due for a touchdown regression. So like all kind of came at once. And it's like, all right, that was the time to play him. Of course, he was on everyone's bench in like the worst matchup you could ask for. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, he's just fine. Like I don't think that he's going to be the reason you win or lose your league. So if you can move him to get up to maybe a league winning type player, like for example, I would trade Hopkins for Tank Dell. Like that's what I would do. I would sell out on the name brand of DeAndre Hopkins to grab Tank Dell, who is like a wide receiver 1 in terms of fantasy points per game that I don't think a lot of people would actually realize.
Alfredo, are you buying, selling, or holding on DeAndre Hopkins?
I don't want to buy because I don't think I'm going to get the price that he's actually worth. I think that with the performance that he had, the 3 touchdown performance, there's going to be a lot of people that are still riding that high. And then a lot of people that are going to be leaning into, well, he got 11 targets in week 9. I think we're looking at a very similar situation here to Davante Adams. But I think that Davante Adams is the better player at this point in his career. I do kind of agree with Erickson here that I think that the Will Levis balloon pops at some point and we don't see this same guy. I mean, I don't think that Will Levis has been bad by any stretch of the imagination, but I also think there's been some of those touchdowns very easily could have just been interceptions on underthrown balls that hung in the air forever and ever. So I like that he's targeting Hopkins a bit more. I just don't think that in a trade, I'm going to actually get him for what I think he's worth. I think you'd have to overpay for him, and I just don't know if that's worth it at this time in the year.
So based on what both of you guys said, I'm pretty sure you're going to not agree with any of these trades, but these are all real trades that have gone down, so I'll throw them out anyway and just get your opinion. First one here, Alfredo, DeAndre Hopkins for Brandon Aiyuk.
Give me Aiyuk.
How about DeAndre Hopkins for Dalton Kincaid?
Oh, a little cross-positional here. Tight end sucks, so I guess if you can have a guy that's going to give you maybe top 7 or 8 at production at tight end, yeah, give me Dalton Kincaid.
And then lastly, DeAndre Hopkins and Rashad White for T. Higgins and Raheem Mostert.
Oh, that's just got a lot of gross all over it. Like I keep like picking players I don't like out of that. I'm just gonna X out the running backs there and make this DeAndre Hopkins for T. I've totally taken over the show. DeAndre Hopkins for T. Higgins. I'd rather have T. Higgins going forward. So, yeah.
Erickson, what do you think about any of those? Again, it was DeAndre Hopkins for Brandon Aiyuk, it was Hopkins for Dalton Kincaid, and it was Hopkins and Rashad White for T. Higgins and Raheem Mostert.
Alfredo asking for danger here in darkness with Rashad White, who's coming off his breakout game, man. Rashad White finally hit. So, I mean, that one's tough because I do like White. I don't really like, I guess I would probably take the White and Hopkins side there. Again, I don't think that T. Higgins will necessarily be that much better than Hopkins. I think that both guys will be wide receiver 2s for the rest of the season. The Aiyuk deal, I love. I love Brandon Aiyuk, getting him off the bye week. I don't even care if Deebo Samuel's back. Like, Aiyuk is such an alpha. The 49ers schedule is so great. I think Aiyuk could be a top 5 wide receiver rest of season. So I love going after Brandon Aiyuk and selling DeAndre Hopkins to get him. I think is highway robbery. So yeah, those are kind of my thoughts on those deals.
What about the Kincaid one?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Again, we've talked about this before where wide receiver is more replaceable. Like, let's say you have Tank Dell on your bench. Tank Dell has scored more fantasy points per game than DeAndre Hopkins. Like, so we just get rid of Hopkins and just start Tank Dell instead.
All right, let's go to the buy low wide receivers. Alfredo, who's your top guy here?
This one seems really obvious, but I just don't know that enough fantasy managers are looking at this, and you sometimes have to point out the obvious. I'm going with Marquise Brown, wide receiver for the Arizona Cardinals. I think he is the perfect buy low. When you're trying to frame this, this is the kind of guy that you'd be looking at. The last 4 games have been really rough for him. He's been the wide receiver 50 in points per game and wide receiver 40 total. He's been averaging, when we saw him with Kyler Murray last time, Kyler Murray's coming back. There's not really any of these wide receivers out here that have been struggling lately where you say, oh, okay, they're going to get a top tier quarterback with great arm talent coming back and lining up under center. So when he has been with Kyler Murray and no DeAndre Hopkins, we were looking at a guy that was getting a 24% target share, nearly 10 targets per game. He was really, really good. And then shout out to the guys over at Fantasy Points, looking at their data suite over there. Marquise Brown is 10th in expected fantasy points lost due to uncatchable passes.
Jeez.
With 5 fantasy points per game. That would have put him up around 17 PPR points per game. I know it's not that simple. Like, that's just not how math works and averages and whatnot, but that would make him a top 10 fantasy wide receiver. I'm not suggesting he's going to go from, being wide receiver 40 over the past few games to top 10, but here's a guy that I think is probably top 20 rest of season. And you can probably go out and get him for wide receiver 3 value at this point. With Kyler coming back, honestly, I think I'd rather have Marquise Brown over DeAndre Hopkins, who we mentioned earlier.
Marquise Brown is down at wide receiver 34 rest of season. I'm not sure if everybody has accounted for Kyler coming back imminently in those rest of season rankings, according to the experts, but that's a pretty low ranking, a pretty attainable guy. Erickson, where do you have Marquise Brown rest of season?
Yeah, no, I haven't fully updated it with the news that Kyler Murray is going to be starting because we still weren't sure if he was going to come back. So I had him originally at wide receiver 30, but he would definitely be someone I would be moving probably closer to the Texans wide receivers. I'd probably move him above both Jacksonville wide receivers over Kirk, over Ridley. Probably move him over Olave too. Olave for Marquise Brown, I would make that deal. I would sell Chris Olave to get Marquise Brown.
That might be something you can actually get done based on the rankings as well. Let's go now to our favorite segment. It's the Uber Eats player we'd give up almost anything for. This week, that player is Erickson's buy low wide receiver, DeVonta Smith. Erickson, what makes Smith such a great buy low candidate?
So DeVonta Smith has been living in the A.J. Brown wide receiver 1 season shadow pretty much all year. And that was something I was concerned about entering the year where, DeVonta Smith, I wasn't sure how big of a target share he would get with a healthy A.J. Brown, Dallas Goedert. And last year we saw when Dallas Goedert went down, DeVonta Smith was a fantasy wide receiver 1. And that's why I didn't want to draft him as a fringe fantasy wide receiver 1 because Dallas Goedert was healthy. Well, throw that out the window because Dallas Goedert's injured now. So unless the only thing that I could see this being different from last year is if we see Swift take on a larger role of the targets because Miles Sanders obviously was not commanding any targets in this offense. But besides that, it should be DeVonta Smith as a wide receiver 1 alongside A.J. Brown in this offense for the rest of the season, with Dallas Goedert slated to miss at least 4 games being put on injured reserve with the fractured forearm. So DeVonta Smith has been quiet. Again, he's caught some touchdowns the last couple weeks, so he's put up some production. But overall, he's been disappointing. And I think that you can still get him as a buy low because the manager that might have him may not realize the actual real ceiling Smith can offer with Dallas Goedert silent, which we saw last year. And that's the reason why we were drafting DeVonta Smith so high during draft season, because of the production he put in the second half of the year with Dallas Goedert out. Well, history is going to repeat itself. So I like DeVonta Smith, especially when you look at the schedule. So they have their bye week this week, another opportunity we can buy him because he's not playing. Chiefs, Bills, 49ers, Cowboys. Again, a lot of potential shootouts. So I like Smith.
What kind of ceiling are you putting on him for as long as Goddard's out?
I mean, I think he can be a fantasy wide receiver. I mean, why can't he be a fantasy wide receiver? It's exactly what he did last year. He was a top 12 fantasy wide. I mean, he's actually like top 5. Yeah. I don't think I wouldn't be that aggressive putting him there, but I have him ranked wide receiver 12, my rest season rankings. Like him or Puka Nacua. Puka is one that's he's on the downtick because of the addition of Cooper Kupp, Stafford injury. So right now I'd rather have DeVonta Smith.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. What do you think, Alfredo? Where do you have DeVonta Smith? He's wide receiver 16 right now in the rest of the season rankings. I think that's going to continue to go up, especially with the the Goddard developments. So where would you have him? And do you agree with him as kind of a top buy low candidate?
Yeah, I don't have my rest of the season wide receiver rankings solidified, but I'd probably, looking at it right now, I'd probably have him around that 13, 14 range, and maybe even a little bit higher. What I like about him and for the Eagles, that the strength of schedule is really nice for the wide receivers going forward. They've got some really competitive games coming up, right? It's not going to be a cakewalk, and that might not be great overall for the Eagles, but it should provide some good game script, some heavy passing game script for the Eagles. And I think the only thing that gives me a little bit of pause is that AJ Brown is commanding targets at a volume that he was not doing last year. And he's, really separated himself as the alpha of this team. And Jalen Hurts hasn't been nearly as efficient passing the ball as he was last year. So I think those are the only two things that give me pause. But I do think that DeVonta Smith is an excellent buy low. And I'd probably put him in there on that fringe wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 status.
Would you flip Waddle for him straight up?
I think they're really close. I think they are very, very close, the two of them.
I know we talked about the Dolphins' schedule being really bad. So I think that's what we do for me. Like just the schedule alone, like Waddle and Smith are both wide receiver 2s. They both should be at least the number 2 on their offenses, but Smith has a better schedule. So that's why I would lean Smith, but
I think I agree with you there that I might lean Smith by like a smidge.
It's close, but it's definitely a deal you could do because they're both on bye. So it's like you could make that move happen.
Yeah, I would say this for the Dolphins, for Jalen Waddle, the wide receiver schedule is a bit friendlier than the running back schedule overall. They have something very similar to the Eagles where it's going to be, a lot of game script dependent stuff where they're going to be passing that ball a bit more.
Get food from your favorite restaurants, plus groceries and other essentials delivered straight to your front door with Uber Eats. This football season, stay planted on your couch and get anything, almost anything you need for game day by ordering on the Uber Eats app. Uber Eats, the official on-demand delivery partner of the NFL. Order now, alcohol in select markets. Product availability may vary by region. See app for details. Alfredo, give me your top sell high wide receiver.
I'm kind of cheating once again. He's not necessarily a sell high. This is kind of a sell low. I think that just at this point in the season, you really need to establish your identity and your roster and the players you can count on. And we're at the point where you just cannot count on DK Metcalf. And I think that if you have fantasy managers in your league that are willing to buy on the name value of DK Metcalf and hope that he can, it's got to get better, right? I don't think it necessarily does. He's had one game this year as a top 24 wide receiver. He's a wide receiver 43 currently. And there's just so many factors surrounding this. Geno Smith has not been as good as he was last season. And I think a lot of people were waiting for this to happen. Geno was one of those quarterbacks that had, I think it was like top 2 or 3 in most turnover worthy passes last year. And that's kind of coming to fruition. Not that he's been a turnover machine, but he just hasn't been nearly as good. Jackson Smith and Jigba is getting more work. Pete Carroll continues doing Pete Carroll things and wanting to commit more to the run and understanding that he's got to slow down the game a bit, and that Seahawks defense continues to improve. So we might start to see a Seahawks identity where the defense, even though they got absolutely obliterated by the Ravens this last week, they've outside of that game, they've been good. And so I think we end up seeing a Seahawks defense that is good, a Seahawks run game that kind of takes over a little bit. I think you can probably, I go back to the guy who I was putting as a buy low. I think you could trade DK Metcalf for Marquise Brown straight up, just based on the name value for DK Metcalf. And I think that Brown is going to be giving you better results throughout the rest of the season. Or I think you can also package Metcalf to go and get a better guy, like one of those DeVonta Smith type players. DK Metcalf and another wide receiver or a low end running back for a DeVonta Smith, I think makes a ton of sense.
Erickson, you have been one of the high guys on Metcalf for, during draft season and in the early part of the year. Have you kind of come down a bit and are on Alfredo's side on this one?
No, actually, I disagree with Alfredo. So they're playing the Commanders this week, the worst secondary in the NFL. That if Mac Jones had actual receivers, he would have done way more damage against this defense. Emmanuel Forbes is going to be having nightmares about DK Metcalf trying to cover this guy because we saw what AJ Brown was able to do to him. So Metcalf is still seeing all the peripheral usage you want to see. Like he's still seeing a ton of air yards, still seeing a ton of red zone targets. He's had bad matchups to start the year. Last two matchups, Browns and Ravens. Can we agree both those are really bad matchups? They are. You know the matchup that was good that the Seahawks had was the Cardinals. That was the game that Metcalf didn't play in. So the one matchup that he's had that's been favorable over the last month, he didn't get a chance to play in that game. He has 8 targets or more in 3 of his last 5 games. I think that he's due for an eruption spot. Look, Metcalf is wide receiver 43 right now in the current statistics. He's never been lower than a fantasy wide receiver 2 his entire NFL career. So that's what I kind of look at. I'm looking at the big sample size here, and it's like Metcalf's probably going to finish as a wide receiver 2 when it's all said and done because that's what he's done every single year of his NFL career. The sample size is massive. So the fact that he's now been a wide receiver 4 to start the year, when you look at all the matchups he's played, he hasn't had like a favorable matchup all year long. And the ones that he has, he's taken advantage of. Over 100 yards against the Panthers, over 75 yards against the Lions. But this last month has been tough. Bengals, Browns, Ravens. Tougher defenses against wide receivers. And the only favorable matchup was that Cardinals matchup that he missed with the injury. But upcoming, you have the Commanders. Again, talked about that matchup. Rams, 49ers, Cowboys, 49ers again, Eagles, Titans, Steelers. Like, there are some smash spots for DK Metcalf, so I'm actually going to be on the buying side here.
Erickson, let's stick with you. Who's your top sell high wide receiver?
Nico Collins. I hate putting this guy on this list because I love Nico Collins and was really like aggressively drafting him this year, but I think that if I had to pick a Texans receiver to own the rest of the season or manage the rest of the season, I would pick Tank Dell. And I think that's not necessarily the consensus take when it comes to viewing these players. I think that Nico is still kind of viewed as the wide receiver 1. He'd be kind of drafted as a wide receiver 1 during draft season. He's obviously been productive and he's been a top 15 wide receiver, but looking at where he wins, he's more of a perimeter wide receiver. He doesn't benefit from like softer matchups in the slot. So he's more matchup dependent. We've seen that throughout the year. Like he's had a bunch of games where he's been up and been down. And this past week, he was buried in terms of the target share. Like Tank Dell was out targeting him. Noah Brown was seeing a lot of targets. Dalton Schultz was seeing a lot of targets. Nico Collins scored the touchdown early in the game, but didn't do a lot after that. So again, I feel like I'm flip-flopping on Collins and Dell every single week, not trying to be, a prisoner of the moment, but the fact that Tank Dell is doing what he's doing as a rookie, whereas Nico Collins is a guy who's been in the NFL for a couple seasons, I think I can, if I want to sell high on this Texans hype with CJ Stroud, I think Collins is the guy I would probably try to move for someone that I think has a more solidified role on their prospective offense. And the Texans have a tougher matchup this week. They're going on the road. They're not playing the Buccaneers at home. Texans have been much better at home than on the road. So I want to cash out and take advantage of this boom from the Texans offense with Nico Collins, who I think is going to be more boom or bust than Tank Dell rest of season.
Alfredo, would you rather have Nico Collins or Tank Dell rest of season?
Oh, I was really hoping you wouldn't ask me this because I don't.
It's tough. It's tough.
Like I can't give you an objectively good answer on this. Like, it's just like if you have one of them, cool. Like just keep them because you don't want to miss out on these big CJ Stroud boom games. I think a few weeks ago I would have said, I would be leaning Nico Collins. But I mean, we're starting to see things here, man, where like Tank Dell is becoming the primary read on a lot of these CJ Stroud throws. And I think they're using Tank Dell in better ways than Nico Collins. They're getting Tank out into space. They're sending Tank deep. They're using him on these intermediate routes. Whereas I understand that Nico is, the supposed wide receiver 1 and that classic X type player. But I mean, Tank Dell and that relationship with CJ Stroud is kind of undeniable. So I think I might agree with Erickson here on Dell.
Nico is ranked as wide receiver 22 in the rest of season rankings, and Dell is down at wide receiver 28. So they're close, but there is a bit of a small gap there between the two guys, according to the experts. We'll see how that continues to change moving forward. Let's wrap up with some listener questions coming from Twitter. Question number 1, would we rather have Jalen Waddle or Cooper Kupp moving forward? Alfredo?
This is so similar to the Jalen Waddle, DeVonta Smith thing, but I think I would take both of those guys over Cooper Kupp at this point. And I think it's mostly just about Matthew Stafford. I think he started off hot. I just don't want to have a quarterback that's going to be dealing with an injury rest of season. And I think that Waddle's got a better schedule. It's a little bit friendlier. His quarterback's not hurt. And like we talked about earlier, there's a decent buy low opportunity while the Dolphins are on a bye and coming off a loss here against Kansas City, where I think you can go and get Jalen Waddle for a pretty decent price. Whereas Cooper Kupp, we've sort of started to see him tail off a bit. And I know that this last week doesn't really count because it was Brett Rippon, but I do think that going forward, things might be a little bit better for Jalen Waddle and the Dolphins offense.
What do you think, Erickson, Waddle or Kupp?
I think I'm going to keep Cooper Kupp. I really don't think I want to try to get off of him after he played a game with Brett Rippon. It's like, of course, his value is going to be in a bad spot, and they're also going on bye week. But, the Stafford, it was a thumb injury. It's not like a back injury or one of these super degrading injuries where like, oh, he's going to miss the rest of the season. Like, Stafford is a gamer. And honestly, I think that he probably would have played in this game if it was like they got to make the playoffs. Like, I think he would have gutted it out. But because they were going on bye, it made sense for them to sit Matthew Stafford. So I'm going to still stick with Cooper Kupp, and I would at least try to move him after a big game. So
Kupp is 4 spots ahead of Waddle in the rest of season rankings. Just for the record, last question here. Willing to package a deal of Chris Olave and Zay Flowers for a wide receiver upgrade? What type of player should I target? Again, willing to package Olave and Flowers to get a good wide receiver. Who should I be targeting? Erickson, anybody come to mind?
Well, Chase would be the number one guy I would go for. Coming off a so-so game, this back injury thing, don't care. I want to get him on my team. And if it weren't Jamar Chase, the next guy I would go after would be Brandon Aiyuk. I think that Aiyuk is going to just melt faces in the second half of the season. I mean, the 49ers schedule is the best. If you look at the strength of schedule tool on FantasyPros, quarterbacks for the 49ers are number 1. Wide receivers for the 49ers are number 1. I do not trust Debo. I do not trust George Kittle. I do not trust these guys to stay healthy. I trust Aiyuk to stay healthy, who is top 5 in target share and top 5 in air yard share this season. So those would be the 2 guys I would try to go after if I'm trying to upgrade at wide receiver.
Alfredo, any names that you would throw out there, or are you kind of with him on Aiyuk?
So this time of year, I like to get a little less risk averse. I kind of know what my team is, and I want to make sure that whatever I'm doing, I'm upgrading. I think Olave and Flowers are both very good players. So if I'm selling them, I'm packaging them, it needs to be a good upgrade. I'm looking at guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown, who maybe that fantasy managers it's dampered on them because of the bye week and because David Montgomery's coming back. I think especially after a sort of not great game with the Chargers, Keenan Allen is another guy that I'd be looking at as well, where I think both those players are easy upgrades. They're going to have great target volume going forward. And I think they are easy borderline. I mean, wide receiver 1, wide receiver top 12, top 13 wide receivers every single week.
He is Alfredo Brown. Thank you so much for joining us again. For him and for Erickson, I am Ryan Wormley. We will get out of there on that. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time.